Chapter 6. Edwin Stanton continued his investigation as Abraham Lincoln slept his last deep sleep at the Peterson house. His brain was dead and beyond dreaming. By 4 a.m., Stanton was sure that he was dealing with a conspiracy. The evidence found in Booth's hotel included the mysterious Sam letter that seemed to predict the assassination. The recovery of this letter, which Booth had carelessly, or perhaps on purpose, let fall into the hands of the manhunters, was obviously addressed to the actor by an unknown conspirator. Stanton read it and recognized that it was full of clues. Booth had at least 2 co-conspirators named Sam and Mike. Sam was in Baltimore, the assassination was premeditated, planned before March 27th, and the Confederacy might be involved. At the Peterson house, a doctor recorded statistics in the notes he kept, tracking the sad and inevitable deterioration of Lincoln's condition that night. 5:50 a.m., respiration 28 and regular sleeping. 6 a.m., pulse failing, respiration 28. 6:30 a.m., still failing and labored breathing. At the Peterson house, Abraham Lincoln began the death struggle. The end was coming fast. Dr. Leal placed his finger on the pulse in Lincoln's wrist. Another doctor placed his hand over Lincoln's heart. The doctors and nearly every man in the room took watches out of their pockets. It was 7:20 a.m., April 15th, 1865. More than once they had thought Lincoln had passed away, but the strong body resisted death many times through the long night. Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. His heart stopped beating at 7:22 and 10 seconds. It was over. "He is gone. He is dead," one of the doctors said. The occupants of the room stood silent and motionless for a few minutes. Edwin Stanton finally spoke. He asked Reverend Gurley, Lincoln's pastor, whether he would say a few words. "I will speak to God," replied the minister. "Let us pray." He summoned up a very moving prayer, then murmured, "Amen." Stanton broke the long silence. Now he belongs to the angels. Stanton reached for pen and paper and wrote a single sentence. There was nothing else to say. It was the telegram that would transmit the sad news to the nation. Washington City, April 15th, 1865. Major General Dix, New York. Abraham Lincoln died this morning at 22 minutes after 7 o'clock. Edwin M. Stanton. Reverend Gurley and Lincoln's eldest son Robert told Mary the news. She would not go to the room where Lincoln had died. She could not bear it. She never saw her husband's face again. Around 9 o'clock a.m., she left the Peterson house for the White House. The room was empty of all visitors except Edwin Stanton. The morning light streaming through the back windows crossed Lincoln's still face. Stanton closed the blinds, took a small knife or pair of scissors from his pocket, and bent over Lincoln's body. Gently, he cut a generous lock of hair and sealed it in a plain white envelope. Stanton signed his name in ink on the envelope, then addressed the envelope to Mrs. Wells. The memento was not for him, but for Mary Jane Wells, wife of Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wells, and one of Mary Todd Lincoln's few friends in Washington. In 1862, she had helped nurse Willie Lincoln, ill with typhoid fever, until his death. Afterward, she did double duty, nursing Tad Lincoln and caring for Mrs. Lincoln, helpless in her grief. Shortly thereafter, the Wellses' own young son died of diphtheria. With that event, Mary Jane Wells and Mary Todd Lincoln shared a loss that brought them even closer to each other. Stanton knew that if any person in Washington deserved a precious lock of the martyr's hair, it was Mary Jane Wells. She later framed the cherished relic with dried flowers that had decorated Abraham Lincoln's coffin at the White House funeral. Stanton gazed down at his fallen chief and wept. It was time to take Lincoln home. Stanton ordered soldiers to transport the president back to the executive mansion. The men arrived with a plain pine box. It looked like a shipping crate, not a proper coffin for a head of state. Lincoln would not have minded. He had always been a man of simple tastes. This was the plain coffin of a rail splitter. The soldiers wrapped Lincoln in an American flag. They placed him in the box and screwed down the lid. The only sound in the room was the squeaking of the screws being tightened in the holes. The soldiers carried the coffin into the street and loaded it onto the back of a simple horse-drawn wagon. The driver snapped the reins, and the modest parade, escorted by a small group of bare-headed officers on foot, took Abraham Lincoln to the White House. There were no bands, drums, or trumpets, just the beat of the hooves and the footsteps of the officers. Lincoln would have liked the simplicity. Vice President Andrew Johnson was not present when Lincoln died, so the cabinet sent him an official notification of the president's death and of his succession to the presidency. Johnson agreed to take the oath of office at 11 o'clock a.m. in his hotel room at the Kirkwood House. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Simon Chase and the cabinet members found Johnson grave, dignified, and deeply moved. Given the tragic and unique circumstances of his elevation to the presidency, it was decided that it would not be appropriate for him to deliver a formal public inaugural address. Though John Surratt was being sought by Stanton as one of Lincoln's assassins, he had not even been in Washington on April 14th. Instead, he was in Elmira, in upstate New York. The morning Lincoln died, John Surratt heard the news of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Afraid that his name might be connected with Booth's, he fled to Canada. Then he decided that fleeing to Europe offered him the best chance of survival. In Rome, Italy, he joined the Pope's army and eluded capture for a year. In Maryland, Lieutenant David Dana of the 13th New York Cavalry followed leads he received from informants. Unfortunately, he was pursuing the kind of false leads that would come to haunt the manhunters in the days ahead. Little more than an hour before Lincoln died, George Atzerodt rose from his humble room at the Pennsylvania House and left the hotel. As Atzerodt walked along Booth's escape route just 2 blocks from Ford's Theater, he tossed his knife under a wood carriage step into the gutter. A few minutes later, a sharp-eyed woman looking out a 3rd-story window in a building across the street saw it there. The clue, still in its sheath, was taken to the chief of police. From New York City came an offer of help. 12 hours after Stanton had asked its chief of police to send his finest detectives to Washington to help track the president's killer. Stanton also summoned Lieutenant Lafayette C. Baker, one of his favorites, to leave New York for Washington. The executive branch of the government, Vice President Johnson and his cabinet, had survived the night. No other assassinations had occurred. No invading rebel army stormed the Capitol. Secretary Stanton attempted to coordinate the efforts of the local police force, detectives, and the army. Booth and his conspirators had to be caught before they vanished into the Deep South, where they would find aid and comfort in the heart of the Confederacy. At the farm, Dr. Mudd's wife, Frances, rose early, called for her servants to prepare breakfast, and woke her husband. After only 2 hours of sleep, David Harold walked downstairs and joined the Mudds for breakfast, while a servant carried breakfast upstairs for Booth. Booth, his mind and body still exhausted from his great day, stayed in bed. He was too far from Washington to hear the ringing bells of the city's churches tolling and mourning. As he made casual conversation at the breakfast table, Harold appeared unaware of the danger he faced. He was running for his life, but seemed to the Mudds not to have a care in the world. He asked for a razor so that he could shave, and asked Dr. Mudd if he would make a pair of crutches for Booth. Mudd fashioned a crude pair out of a piece of plank and sent them up to Booth. By 8 o'clock a.m., George Atzerodt had walked to Georgetown on his way to his cousin's house. He showed up at the Matthews & Company store and paid a call on an acquaintance. He tried to raise some money, first by selling his watch, then by using his revolver as collateral for a $10 loan. Atzerodt left the store with the money and continued his journey. He would leave Washington. He knew a place where he thought he would be safe. At the executive mansion, the soldiers carried the president's body in its temporary coffin to the 2nd floor for an autopsy. Cutting open Abraham Lincoln's brain and body served little scientific purpose. Surgeons already knew what had killed him, a single bullet through the brain. They hid their morbid curiosity behind the shield of scientific investigation. One surgeon reached for his saws and knives while others watched. They wanted the bullet. The nation could hardly bury its martyred father Abraham with a lead ball lodged in his brain. They cut it out, marked it as evidence, and preserved it for history. His blood, according to a newspaper report, was drained from his corpse by an embalmer, transferred to glass jars, and preserved. When they were finished, Mary Todd Lincoln sent a request. Please cut off a lock of his hair for her. With Dr. Mudd providing assistance and advice, Harold rode to Bryantown to find a buggy or carriage to transport Booth south. When they got within sight of the edge of town, Harold yanked back hard on the reins and brought his horse to a stop. He could not believe what he saw several hundred yards ahead. Mounted men, wearing a uniform Harold recognized: Yankee cavalry, manhunters. Harold had just spotted the 13th New York Cavalry. Lieutenant Dana had led his troops into Bryantown, a well-known place of Confederate intrigue, commandeered the tavern, and occupied the town. Dana intended to establish a command center there, and from Bryantown launch cavalry patrols through the surrounding countryside in pursuit of the Lincoln and Seward assassins. They were just a few miles from Mudd's farm. This was the closest the pursuers had gotten to Booth since the assassination. Harold made a quick decision to get out of Bryantown before he could be spotted by the cavalry. He told Mudd he didn't need a carriage after all. Booth could still ride a horse. Mudd was puzzled by the sudden change in plan, as Booth had not yet told Mudd he was Lincoln's assassin. Mudd continued into Bryantown at a relaxed pace, just as he had done on countless Saturday afternoons. He went about his business, buying supplies, greeting friends and neighbors he passed on the streets. But a strange, wild atmosphere hung over Bryantown. The cavalrymen's faces were angry. Mudd wondered what had happened. Then someone blurted it out. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated in Washington last night. He died early this morning. The cavalry is here in pursuit of the assassin who escaped. Detectives and soldiers were searching the Maryland countryside, hunting the murderer. Most astonishing of all was who had done it. It was the actor, John Wilkes Booth. Mudd remained calm and did not betray the secret known at this moment to him alone. America's most wanted man was hiding in a farmhouse less than 5 miles away. Harold rode to the farm to warn Booth. When he arrived, Booth was still in bed, but he wouldn't be for long. "The cavalry's here," Harold warned. "They're just down the road in Bryantown." It was around 3:00 p.m., Saturday, April 15th, and Booth was in grave danger. Only Samuel Mudd stood between him and disaster. Mudd had the power to end the manhunt for Lincoln's killer that afternoon. All he had to do was tell the soldiers that John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice were hiding at his farm. He could tell them Booth had a broken leg, and he could not run away. He could take them to Booth right now. All he had to do was tell them, and Dr. Samuel A. Mudd would become instantly a national hero. Booth faced the difficult choice of what to do next. If the doctor had betrayed him to the troops in Bryantown, Booth was a dead man. If they did not kill him on the spot at Mudd's farm, they would escort their captured prey back to Washington for a hanging. Instead of fleeing the farm immediately, they waited for the doctor's return. After 6:00 p.m., Mudd finally rode down the main road and made the turn toward the farm. He was alone and brought no cavalry. Booth's judgment of Mudd's character had been correct. He had not betrayed them. Mudd could not hide his distress. He ordered Booth and Harold to leave his farm at once. Ignoring Mudd's anger, Booth focused on the priceless news the doctor had brought back from Bryantown. The president was dead, and the fame was his. Less than 24 hours after the assassination, Dr. Mudd had just given Booth the first confirmation that he had killed Lincoln. Booth might rejoice at the news of the tyrant's death, but Mudd was angry and afraid. By coming there, Booth had placed Mudd and his entire family in great danger. Yes, Mudd had agreed to help Booth with the kidnapping of Abraham Lincoln, but no one had consulted him about murder. Now, by offering Booth his hospitality, he had unknowingly made himself an accomplice in the most shocking crime in all of American history, the murder of the President of the United States. Mudd continued to insist that Booth and Harold leave his farm at once, but he was sympathetic to the assassin situation. He was no fan of Abraham Lincoln, the Union, or black people. Booth may have involved him and abused his hospitality, but not enough to make Mudd betray him. Mudd agreed that, as long as they left immediately, he would still help the assassins. He would not return to Bryantown and report Booth's whereabouts. He would hold his tongue and allow Booth a head start. If the soldiers came to question him, he would say only that 2 strangers in need of medical assistance had stopped briefly at his farm. Then he would send the manhunters in the wrong direction. Mudd gave Booth the names of 2 trustworthy local Confederate operatives, William Birtles and Captain Samuel Cox. Then Mudd explained the route to their next stop on their underground rebel railroad. They must travel southeast in a wide arc to avoid the troops in Bryantown. About 2 miles south, they would find the Birtles place. Cox's farm was several miles further southwest, and from there they would be close to the Potomac River. Mudd also gave Booth the name of a doctor on the Virginia side in case his leg continued to trouble him. David helped Booth climb onto his horse and handed him the crude crutches Mudd had made for him. Mudd, relieved by their leaving, watched them ride off until they vanished from sight. It was around 7:00 p.m., 15 hours since the assassins had arrived at Mudd's door, and just 20 hours since John Wilkes Booth had shot the president. As dusk faded to dark, Booth and Herold continued south, careful to watch for signs of cavalry. The pair had a long night's ride ahead of them, but they had survived the first day undetected. Although Dr. Mudd had shown Booth the route they must take, Booth and Herold got lost. They were fortunate to come upon a local man, Oswell Swan, half black, half Piscataway, who for $7 agreed to take them directly to Captain Cox's place. Oswell Swan earned his pay this night. He guided them safely through the Zacchaeus Swamp, with its muck, snakes, and wild, overgrown vegetation, to the doorstep of Captain Samuel Cox. It was just after midnight, April 16th, Easter Sunday. Chapter 7. Back at Ford's Theater, the investigation was well underway. Stanton was determined to preserve the scene of the crime. He ordered the theater to be surrounded by a 24-hour guard. He wanted photographs of the interior of the theater to record exactly how it appeared at the moment of the assassination. Matthew Brady, who had photographed Lincoln many times, now photographed the scene of his murder. He captured the stage and its scenery as it was at the time of the assassination, the exterior of the president's box, the approach to the box, and the outer door leading to the vestibule. Easter Sunday, 1865, would forever be known as Black Easter to those who lived through it. Abraham Lincoln's murder transformed a time of rejoicing in the Capitol to a time of mourning. Across the country, ministers stayed up late Saturday night and by candle or lamp wrote out the final words of sermons they began composing as soon as they heard the terrible news of the president's death. In the early hours of Black Easter, Booth and Herold sought their salvation, not at church, but at the door of a loyal Confederate. At the Cox house, Herold dismounted and knocked. Booth stayed on his horse under a cover of a tree in the yard. Cox poked his head out from a second-story window and asked, "Who's there?" Herold refused to give his name, not sure if he could trust the captain. He said only that he was with a man who needed help. Suspicious, Cox opened the door and looked out over the worn-out, crazy-eyed man standing before him. The stranger seemed more like a boy than a man. The farmer looked around his yard. Booth dismounted with some difficulty and hobbled up to the porch to the door. In great pain, he pleaded with Cox for help. It was there, by brilliant moonlight, that Cox saw the initials J.W.B. tattooed on the hand of the injured stranger. It was there the sweet-talking actor used his charms and talents to win over the man to his cause. Cox swung open the door and invited the fugitives into his home. To the nation, Black Easter dawned as the day of a great mourning. To John Wilkes Booth, it began as a day of salvation. Precisely what Booth told Cox on the front porch and during the next few hours they spent together in the house remains a mystery. The assassin of the president was in there, injured, desperate, and on the run from a manhunt. Given the unusual things Cox and his son were about to do for Booth, given Booth's state of mind, there is little doubt that Booth confessed all to his hosts. Father and son saw the murderer and his accomplice and decided to help them. Cox helped them decide on their next move. He told Booth there was only one man who could get them safely across the Potomac River. That man was Thomas Jones. They would summon Thomas Jones at sunrise the next morning. For now, it was too dangerous for Booth and Herold to remain at Cox's farm. Instead, they would hide in a heavily wooded pine thicket some distance away. No one would search for them there, Cox reassured them. It was unlikely any locals would happen to see them there. They were not to build a fire. Someone might see it. In the morning, someone would come to them. That person would signal with a specific 3-note whistle as he approached. They were to beware anyone who did not make that sound. Booth and Herold ate the food Cox offered them, saddled them up for their ride to the pine thicket, and rode off with Cox's overseer as their guide. If their luck held, they would cross into Virginia sometime after nightfall within 24 hours. If, that is, They could survive just one more day in Maryland. Booth and Herold entered the pines, dismounted, and tied off their horses. Exhausted, the two men unrolled their blankets on the damp earth, laid down, and gazed up at the immense black sky decorated by countless points of twinkling light. It would be morning in a few hours. If Captain Cox's word was true, it was safe to doze off until then. The rising sun and chirping birds woke Booth and Herold early in the morning. Now they could do nothing but wait. Back at the farm, Captain Cox had to find out whether his friend would actually help Booth and Herold. He sent his son to fetch Thomas Jones right away. Thomas Jones was a Confederate Secret Service veteran who had spent his entire life trailblazing through the fields, thickets, and forests of rural Maryland and navigating its streams, marshes, and rivers. During the war, he had ferried hundreds of men and the occasional female spy across the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. He transported the Confederate mail between the two states and sent south fresh Union newspapers that provided valuable information to the Confederacy. Jones was a valuable and mysterious secret agent operating along the watery borders between Union and Confederate territory. The Union Army had never caught him in action. He was a river ghost to the boys in blue uniforms. His knowledge of the river enabled him to calculate the best time to begin to trip across. They should leave a little before sunset, when the reflection in the water of the high bluffs near Pope's Creek extended out into the Potomac until it nearly met the shadows cast by the Virginia woods. It would be difficult to spot a small rowboat floating in the river. Jones's service to the Confederacy had cost him a great deal. Suspected of disloyalty to the Union, federal forces arrested and jailed him for months at the old Capitol Prison in Washington. When Jones went to the Confederate capital, Richmond, at the beginning of April 1865, to collect the money owed him by the Confederacy, he discovered that the Army had evacuated the city, and he went unpaid. He lost $2,300 owed to him for 3 years of service, along with all the money he had invested in Confederate bonds at the beginning of the war. All this meant Jones needed as much money as he could lay his hands on. At Jones's farm, the Cox boys told Jones his father wished to see him at once. "Some strangers were at our house last night," the boy said. Jones's eyes lit up. Could he mean the heroes who assassinated President Lincoln? The report excited Jones. The day before, Jones learned from Union soldiers that Lincoln had been assassinated, and they had information that the assassins had traveled this way. Jones felt it in his bones. Captain Cox wanted to see him about something connected to the assassination. Jones saddled up and accompanied young Cox to his father's farm. Once he arrived, Captain Cox and Thomas Jones spoke casually for a few minutes until Cox could avoid the subject no longer. "Tom, I had visitors about 4 o'clock this morning," Cox revealed. "They want to get across the river." He spoke in a whisper. "Have you heard that Lincoln was killed Friday night?" "Yes," Jones replied, telling Cox about what he had learned about the assassination from the Union soldiers. Cox finally blurted out, "Tom, we must get those men who were here this morning across that river." Then he told Jones everything about the late-night visit from Booth and Herold. Jones was no coward. 4 years of loyal, dangerous service to the Confederacy had proved that. But the war was over. Jones considered the situation. Then he made up his mind. "I will see what I can do," he said. "I must see these men. Where are they?" Captain Cox told Thomas Jones that Booth and Herold spent the night in the pine thicket. Lincoln's killer was there now, waiting for someone to rescue him. Cox gave Jones the whistle code, a set of 3 notes, and cautioned him to approach the fugitives carefully. "They are fully armed and might shoot you through mistake," he warned. Alone, Jones rode toward his meeting with Lincoln's assassins. At the edge of the thicket, he stopped, whistled the 3 notes, and waited. David Herold rose from the brush and aimed his Spencer carbine at him. The weapon was cocked and ready to fire. "Who are you, and what do you want?" demanded Herold. Jones told Herold that Cox had sent him, and that he was a friend. Herold released his grip on his gun and said, "Follow me." He took Jones deeper into the pines, through the thick undergrowth, to a man partly concealed by the brush. Jones, overcome by a mixture of thrill and fear, saw John Wilkes Booth for the first time. He later recalled that Booth was dressed in stained, dark clothes. Booth was very pale, and his face bore signs of suffering. Booth confided what Jones already knew. Booth had killed Lincoln. The assassin had understood that the odds of escape were against him. He also vowed that he would never be taken alive. Jones was sure he meant it. Jones proposed a plan. He would help Booth and Herold cross the Potomac River to Virginia, but they must leave it to him to decide when and how they would make the attempt. Patience was essential. Meanwhile, Jones would feed them and make preparations for their crossing. Booth and Herold must not leave the pine thicket, make any noise, or do anything that might let anyone know they were there. Jones said that to cross the river they needed a dark night, smooth water, and deserted riverbanks. It would be best to wait for the departure of many of the soldiers and detectives who had already followed Booth south into Maryland. That might take days, and there would be no doctor for Booth until they crossed the river. Jones persuaded the assassins that the best way to escape was to stop running and go into hiding. Manhunters were already nearby. Soon Federal forces would join Lieutenant Dana and fan out across the part of Maryland Booth and Herold were in. They would remain in hiding and let the manhunters sweep through the county before they moved on. Booth's curiosity about public reaction to the assassination led him to make an additional request of Jones. Please bring some current Washington newspapers from the day Lincoln died, or from today, the 16th. Despite his pain and exhaustion, the actor was eager to read about his deed in the papers. Jones mounted his horse, maneuvered through the pine trees, and vanished from sight. Until Jones returned, Booth and Herold were on their own. With his simple plan, Jones had foiled the whole manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. A single Confederate agent, nearly penniless, had just frustrated the frantic pursuit by thousands of men being directed from Washington by Secretary of War Stanton. Late on Easter morning, George Atzerodt showed up at the home of Hezekiah Metz, about 22 miles from Washington and Montgomery County, Maryland, north of Charles County, where Booth and Herold were. Atzerodt joined Metz and 3 of his guests for a midday meal. One of the guests had known him for years, and when Atzerodt arrived, he teased him. "Are you the man that killed Abe Lincoln?" The joke must have frozen Atzerodt in his tracks. Atzerodt laughed and said, "Yes." He also confirmed for the guests that Seward's throat had been cut, his sons attacked. Atzerodt, the slow-witted German, did not know it, but he had just sealed his fate. One of the guests would inform the local authorities of Atzerodt's boast. After dinner, Atzerodt, unaware that he had aroused the suspicions of the guest, traveled to the home of his cousin, Hartmark Richter, arriving after 2 o'clock p.m. That day, Samuel Mudd considered his situation. At some point, probably soon, the soldiers or detectives would discover 2 things about him. He had visitors on assassination night, and, even more damning, he had known ties to Booth. He did not wish to betray Booth, but too many people at Mudd's farm had seen Booth and Herold for Mudd to keep the visit a secret forever. Mudd solved his problem by sending his cousin George, a loyal Unionist and therefore above suspicion by the federal authorities, to town to report Booth's visit to Mudd's farm. The vague second-hand report he would deliver would not likely cause the soldiers to leap into their saddles in pursuit of the 2 strangers. Through the afternoon and into the evening, Dr. Mudd awaited the arrival of the manhunters. But they did not come. In a stroke of good luck for Booth, for unknown reasons, Samuel Mudd's cousin George failed to ride into town to report the strangers to the cavalry. The delay gave Booth an additional lead over his pursuers. In Washington, the manhunt had progressed little. John Wilkes Booth had assassinated the president almost 48 hours before, but the manhunters had no solid leads. Yes, the police, detectives, and officers had found a number of leads on Booth's accomplices, but none led to Booth. Hats, the Derringer pistol, abandoned knives, broken revolvers, jackets, one-eyed horses, bank books, mysterious letters, hotel registers, notes to vice presidents, trunks, rope, spurs, bridles, saddles, and eyewitness accounts were all fine clues that made the assassin seem very near and very vivid, but these would make good evidence at a criminal trial as proof of identity and guilt. The evidence already collected by April 15th confirmed that it was Booth who had shot Lincoln, and that he seemed to have several accomplices. The contents of Atzerodt's room at the Kirkwood, plus Booth's Sam letter, suggested that the vice president had also been marked for death. The evidence pointed to Booth's guilt, but not to how he planned to make his escape. Booth could be anywhere. Many false sightings across the country made the pursuit more difficult. With each passing hour, Booth's trail grew a little colder. Soon, he would disappear forever. Booth's skill at avoiding the manhunters increased the government's embarrassment over its failure to find him. On the night of April 16th, Stanton had no idea of John Wilkes Booth's location or destination. Yes, it was probably Booth who had given the name Booth to Sergeant Cobb at the bridge and fled into Maryland. But where did he go after that? On Monday, April 17th, Thomas Jones appeared to go about his business as usual. He did his chores and ate his usual breakfast. He grabbed some bread, butter, and ham, filled a flask with coffee, and stuffed everything into his pockets. He folded the newspapers and stashed them into his coat. He carried a basket of corn on his arm to throw off any Union troops he might encounter. If stopped and questioned, he would claim that he was on his way to feed his hogs, which ran free in the woods. A little before 10 o'clock a.m., Jones rode toward the pine thicket. About 100 yards from Booth's camp, Jones dismounted, walked slowly, and whistled the secret signal as he came within earshot of the assassins. Booth and Herold welcomed him and the food he brought with open arms. Booth was especially eager to see the other treats Jones brought, the newspapers. At last, 3 long days after the assassination, he could read about his history-making actions and how they were reported to the nation. He must have delighted in reading the details of the assassination as reported in the papers, as though reading the reviews of a performance. Booth's pleasure at reading about his success in killing Lincoln could not hide his worsening condition. His leg was in bad shape, and Booth was obviously in great pain. As Jones discussed the escape plan with Booth and Herold, he became distracted when he heard the familiar and terrifying sound in the distance, clanking metal and horses' hooves pounding the earth. Instantly, Jones recognized the sound, cavalry sabers slapping the saddles of Union troops riding in their direction. It was too late for them to try to hoist Booth onto a saddle to attempt escape. A fight was out of the question. Booth could not walk, Jones was unarmed, and Herold had never been in battle before. With only 2 revolvers and 1 carbine, they couldn't hold off a patrol of Union cavalry for long. The 3 men hugged the ground and held their breath. The cavalry horses got within 200 yards. It was Booth's closest brush with capture since he galloped down the alley behind Ford's Theater. Lucky for Booth, instead of turning into the thicket, the troops remained on the road, past the thicket, and rode until the sound of hoofbeats vanished in the distance. Jones locked eyes with Booth. "You see, my friend, we must wait." "Yes," Booth agreed. "I leave it all with you." On the morning of the 17th, another man waited too. Troops had not called on Dr. Mudd to pursue his tip because they still did not know about it. It wasn't until the next afternoon that George Mudd rode into Bryantown. He made a vague report to Lieutenant Dana. 2 suspicious strangers visited his cousin's farm seeking medical attention. Then, in another unbelievable stroke of good luck for Booth and Herold, Dana ignored the news as old and unimportant. He thanked George Mudd and sent him on his way. He did not send troops to Mudd's farm to investigate. Distracted by other leads, many of them dead ends, Lieutenant Dana ignored the one tip that placed Lincoln's assassin within his reach. When soldiers would not come by his farm by that evening, Dr. Mudd relaxed. Perhaps at this point they would not come at all. With the assassin's trail in Maryland growing cold, the soldiers would soon leave and shift the action to other places far from Bryantown and his farm. Thomas Jones had experienced enough excitement for one day. He agreed to return to the thicket to feed Booth and Herold the next morning, but he refused to bring horse feed again. It was difficult to carry enough feed for the horses, and Jones feared a passing cavalry patrol would hear their horses, which were hungry, restless, and noisy. The horses had served them well, and Herold loved animals, but they all agreed that the horses must be disposed of. The horses' reward for faithful service was death. Herold led them to a quicksand pit about a mile away, shot them, and then sank their bodies. Herold returned to the thicket and sat on the ground beside Booth. Never during their escape were they more vulnerable and alone. If the Union cavalry found them now, they would not be able to make a run for it. Exhausted and injured, Booth could not hope to outrun a mounted pursuit. And if Thomas Jones abandoned them, how would they find a way to cross the river? Later, in the safety of the night, Booth and Harold rolled out their woolen blankets and spent another night on the ground.